Thank you, Matt, and thank you all of you for coming out today. When I was driving in, it was completely blinding white, and I thought, oof, but it's a full crowd, so I really appreciate it. In April 2018, a friend of the archive named Paula Sitzmer-Reamer gave us this gavel. If you were to read the words around the band, it says Spiegel's Cousins Club. And I was immediately smitten with it because I saw it as the work of a kind of an idiosyncratic family that just had so much love for itself that it wanted to create kind of like a silly object to commemorate it. And it turns out that I was correct, but that I had no idea the extent of what I was looking at. Anytime we take an object into the archive, we research it. We want to know everything we can know about it, including its historical context. And I was confident that I could find some useful information in the archives about the Spiegel's Cousins Club. So I started looking through the Jewish newspapers, and in fact, I did. I found this entry, which was announcing that this club was being formed, and it was listing all of the founding directors of this club. What I did not expect was that this entry was part of a whole column on family clubs, and that this column appeared in the Jewish newspaper every single week for about 10 years, and that it also appeared in the competing newspaper because it was so popular that both newspapers wanted to have it in their newspapers. And so all of a sudden I realized that this story was much bigger than I thought it was. I had never heard of family clubs before, and I was fascinated by the idea of a club where all the members were related to each other. So I started to research it, and I found that there was actually very little scholarship about this. There was only one book-length study that I was able to find. It was written by an Irish guy, an Irish Catholic guy, in the 1970s. It was called Mishpoche, which is Yiddish for family. And it looked just at the family clubs of New York, but it included a lot of useful historical information that was relevant to Pittsburgh. According to this book, these family clubs were a phenomenon that was completely unique to American Jews of Ashkenazi heritage. These are Jews who are coming primarily from Europe, Eastern Europe. And it was only in the Jewish community. It didn't really have widespread application in other immigrant communities. And it also didn't really seem to have much of an antecedent in Europe. There were clubs in Europe, but nothing that was based purely around the family. I also found the work of a scholar named Myrna Silverman, who was local, and she said that these clubs lasted much longer in Pittsburgh than they had in other places, and that they were more widespread here. So the Rauh Jewish Archives is very vast and diverse, and I figured if something was widespread, we should have examples of it here. So I started digging around in some of the collections that we have, and I found hidden in a lot of family collections, little pieces here and there. There were all sorts of these family clubs, and the materials were just wonderful. They included things like minutes. So you're looking here at the minutes of the Ka-El Family Society. They included dues ledgers. They included newsletters. So this is the Ka-El Comments, and this is the Gruber Gazette. They included membership rosters. So these are family tree from the Spiegel Cousins Club, and a family tree, they called it the statistics of the Preter Family Club. And of course, photographs as well. So this is from a Preter Cousins Club reunion, and this is from the Weiss family reunion in 1992. These records were often hidden inside larger collections, and the only way we were able to find them is by kind of creatively searching for them. There wasn't actually a subject heading for them at the time. Having now spent a few years with these collections, I've started to understand some of the larger history, at least locally. The first Jewish family club in the region was most likely the Podolsky-Sherman Family Union. It was founded in 1932 by 6 siblings, and it originally was created to provide no-interest loans to family members who were facing hard times. But it also served a social function, which created an opportunity for families to get together. The club operated completely privately until 1937, when it published this letter in the local American Jewish Outlook. One of the members, Saul Podolsky, was encouraging other families to start these clubs. And there's this wonderful note in here where he says that brothers and sisters who formerly would visit each other once or twice a year now meet almost without fail every month. Birthdays and anniversaries are officially celebrated. Words cannot describe the feeling of intimacy and loyalty that was built up through these meetings, especially among the younger children of our members. Throughout the 1930s and 40s, not a lot of families actually took them up on this. There were a few: the Mother and Father Shapiro Club, the Rest Cousins Club, the Eli and Diane Kalik Family Club, and the Herman and Sarah Gollum Cousins Club were among them. But the growth of these family clubs really took off in the 1950s, and it appears to be the confluence of several interrelated trends. The first is that by the 1950s, many American families were now in their third generation in America. Suburbanization was beginning, and a lot of families were starting to spread farther apart. And there were also probably the lingering echoes of World War II and the Holocaust, which probably made families seem a lot more precious than it had before. So while the second generations had strong family ties because those families were often growing up in close proximity to each other, the third generations often were spread across very vast distances. So this is a map showing the location of all the meetings of one of these clubs, the Maxan Cousins Club. And you can see that the members of this club live in Oakland, they live in East Liberty, in Stanton Heights, in Squirrel Hill, in Swissvale, in Monroeville. There's some out in the South Hills here. So you can see that by the 1950s, this family was spread across a pretty wide swath of Pittsburgh. And these club meetings allowed them to kind of come together for Jewish holidays, for bar and bat mitzvahs, for weddings and funerals and the like. As the post-war grandchildren began leaving for college in the mid-1960s, that's when the momentum of these clubs began to slow. And then with the population loss in Pittsburgh in the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of the branches of these families started leaving the area. They were spread across the country rather than across the region, and it became hard to meet. Some of the clubs started to meet sporadically through family reunions every 5 or 10 years or so, but others simply faded away. One thing that was very interesting in the last few years is that some of these clubs during the pandemic were actually revived as Zoom meetings when now all of a sudden you could get together over long distances. So this is the Gruber Family Club at an Israel Day parade in 1973, and then the club meeting again in 2020 in virtual format. In pulling these collections together, I started to notice that a trend was emerging. All of the clubs that we had materials for, those materials had arrived within the past few years. So it was nothing older in the archive. It was all within the last 2 or 3 years of when I started looking at this. And that's actually a pretty common phenomenon here in the archive. And it's one that we always note with great interest. People often donate materials to the archive at a specific moment of transition. It's a retirement or a move or the downsizing of a home or an office or the death of a loved one. And those sorts of transitions typically occur at a certain point in life, usually after middle age. The people who use our collections, it's a broad range from small children to people in their 90s and older. But the people who donate materials to our collection are often in a much narrower age range, usually 55 and older. When you have people of the same age and they're from the same community, they often share cultural markers. And as a result, we often see trends among incoming collections. And these trends evolve over time as each new generation is passing into that age range. When I started working here at the archive in the early 2010s, we were still getting World War II letters. And now, 10 or 12 years later, we're starting to move into the 1950s and the 1960s. The sudden influx of all these family club records was a perfect example of this phenomenon. These clubs were most active in the 1950s and 60s. And by the late 2010s, the children of that era were approaching their 70s and 80s, and they were beginning to sort through the things that they had collected from their parents and had never dealt with yet. I continue to look for family club materials in the archive and also to keep out for new collections, an eye out for new collections in the community. But the initiative remained in somewhat low gear until the pandemic lockdown of early 2020. We had a student intern at that time who suddenly needed a remote volunteering project, and I felt that the family clubs were the perfect opportunity. Using the digitized newspapers that are available on the Pittsburgh Jewish Newspaper Project, we asked him to compile a list of all the known family clubs in Western Pennsylvania. We've since expanded that list and we've found 129 of these family clubs just within the Western Pennsylvania region. These sorts of data collecting projects have always been part of the work of archivists and librarians, but I believe they are increasingly important today. These projects make the archives more accessible. Accessibility is the cornerstone, well, it's a cornerstone of the archival profession. The goal is not simply to preserve objects, it's to make them as easy as possible for people to use and to find. Before digitization, the biggest obstacle to accessibility was just getting people physically into the archive, which is why we appreciate it so much that you're all here today. The objects always stay here, which means that the researcher needs to come to us. For local researchers, that was often an inconvenience or an annoyance that they could put up with. But for out-of-town researchers, it sometimes made research impossible. With digitization, we're able to accommodate many more researchers than we were in the past. For big research requests, it's always best to come do the research yourself. Nobody's going to care about your project as much as you will. But for smaller projects, we're often able to make reproductions at a small fee for people that allows them to access us or other archives all over the country without having to book a plane flight. In the digital age, though, there is more historical information available than ever before, and that volume actually creates an unexpected impediment to accessibility because it's so much information to sift through. So for example, as we studied this list, we started to realize that this was an incredible genealogical tool. And so working with the local Jewish Genealogy Society of Pittsburgh, we began compiling data sets for each of these families. We collected all the available newspaper notices for each one, and then we extracted 3 key pieces of data: the surnames that are listed in each club, the addresses where they had events, and the dates that the club was active. We compile these into these capsule summaries, which we publish at a rate of about 1 a month in our newsletter. So far we've done about 45 of the 129 clubs that are in the database. The database and these capsule summaries greatly simplify family tree research. With these surnames, you can quickly run through a sequence of searches in a database like newspapers.com or ancestry.com, and you can discover new connections that might have taken a much longer time to find. I know that this works because the way I compile these is I run all these through these databases. Each of these summaries takes about 2 hours to compile. If you think about it, each of these clubs has maybe 50 to 100 living members in them, and that number is likely to grow as each generation passes, which means that by us undertaking this work in a centralized place, we save that family hundreds of hours of research time. The genealogist can put that time towards expanding their family tree in other directions, and the historians can put that time towards interpretation or presentation. Everyone benefits when we make this material more accessible. Accessibility also creates a virtuous cycle for us, because as we publish these capsule summaries online, word spreads and then new collections come into the archive. So in the 5 years that we've been working on this project, we've doubled the number of family club records that we have in the archives. I really cannot get enough of these clubs. I think they're the perfect example of the role that documentation plays in our lives. If you were to remove the club structure from any of these clubs, you're really just looking at a family gathering. So what's the difference between a big family supper at Bubby and Zadie's house and the members of a family club taking minutes at their annual dinner? When used thoughtfully by people who appreciate them, these sorts of formalities are a way of making relationships look as important as they feel. Thank you.